In February, the Arctic Ocean does not look like somewhere anything should be alive. The surface is solid ice from horizon to horizon. Beneath it, total darkness. The water temperature sits below the freezing point of fresh water, held liquid only by its salt content. No light, no warmth, no obvious reason for any warm-blooded creature to be here. And yet something is down there, beneath that ice. An animal the size of a small car descends through black water toward a depth of nearly 5,000 feet, about 1,500 meters. It breathes air. It is warm-blooded, and it has been making dives like this, in water like this, every winter of its life, as did its mother and her mother before her, stretching back 15 million years. At the deepest point of its dive, its heart rate drops to 3 or 4 beats per minute. Its muscles are still working hard. In every other mammal that science has studied, that combination, maximum effort, near zero heart rate, causes the heart to fail. In this animal, it appears to happen regularly. Nobody fully understands how. Projecting from its face is a single spiraling structure up to 10 feet long, 3 meters, that humanity has been staring at for 1,000 years without agreeing on what it does. Kings paid fortunes for it. The Catholic Church declared it sacred. Queen Elizabeth I was given one valued at the price of an English castle. For centuries, the people selling it told buyers it came from a unicorn, and no one could travel far enough north to prove them wrong. Then, in early 2025, drone cameras finally filmed this animal using that structure in the wild for the first time in scientific history. What the footage showed had not appeared in any prior theory, any prior study, or any prior description of this species, and it is still not the full answer. This animal has survived every ice age, every mass extinction, and every transformation this planet has thrown at it for 15 million years. In this story, we're descending beneath the Arctic ice to follow the narwhal, one of the strangest whales ever to evolve, and uncover what its extraordinary biology has been hiding. A narwhal does not have the shape most people expect from an animal carrying something so extravagant. Remove that long projection from the picture, and the body beneath it is compact, rounded, and remarkably streamlined, built less for display than for moving through an ocean crowded by ice. Its scientific name, Monodon monoceros, combines Greek and Latin roots that are usually rendered as one tooth, one horn. The name captures the feature that first drew European attention, yet leaves most of the animal undescribed. An adult male can measure between 13 and 18 feet from head to tail and weigh close to 4,000 pounds. That measurement stops at the face. The long structure extending beyond it adds its own considerable length, making a mature male appear larger than his body measurements suggest. Age changes the narwhal almost as visibly as size. Calves enter the world dark gray, their skin comparatively uniform. As years accumulate, lighter patches spread across the body, breaking the gray into irregular fields of brown, black, and white. Mature animals become increasingly mottled, while very old males may fade until much of the body is nearly white. Seen among broken ice, an elderly narwhal can seem almost absorbed into the surrounding surface, its outline interrupted by pale water and drifting fragments above. This body belongs to one of only 2 whale species that remain within Arctic waters throughout their lives. The other is the beluga, a white whale with which the narwhal shares its closest living ancestry. Their evolutionary separation has not made them completely incompatible. On rare occasions, narwhals and belugas have produced hybrid offspring, animals informally called narlugas, carrying physical traces of both lineages. The head is blunt and rounded, without the pronounced beak seen in many dolphins. Small paired flippers project from the sides, while broad tail flukes provide the main propulsive force. The Arctic has also shaped what the narwhal lacks. Along its back, there is no upright dorsal fin. Instead, the spine runs beneath a low ridge. For a whale moving beneath uneven ice, where frozen projections can descend unexpectedly into its path, a tall fin would create another surface to strike, scrape, or trap. Over evolutionary time, the narwhal body became smooth, where many other whales remained tall. That streamlined back moves through a social world. Narwhals commonly travel in groups of roughly 5 to 20 animals, often organized around sex, age, and family relationships. During seasonal movements, those smaller groups can converge. Hundreds may travel through the same waters, and exceptional gatherings can number in the thousands, turning scattered family units into broad migrations stretching across the Arctic seascape. Biologically, narwhals belong among the toothed whales, the odontocetes, a lineage that includes dolphins, porpoises, sperm whales, and belugas. Members of this group use sound to interpret their surroundings through echolocation, sending out clicks and reading the returning echoes. Yet the narwhal is an anatomical exception within that family. Its mouth contains almost none of the functional teeth expected from a toothed whale. The feature that made the species famous is connected to this unusual dental arrangement, although its significance extends far beyond the simple meaning preserved in its scientific name. Life proceeds slowly in these animals. Females can survive beyond 50 years, passing through decades of migration, pregnancy, nursing, and repeated seasonal returns. Males generally appear to have somewhat shorter lives. Much of that existence unfolds beyond direct human observation, among shifting ice fields and remote Arctic channels visited only briefly by researchers. A narwhal may therefore spend half a century moving through familiar waters while remaining almost entirely unseen by the people attempting to understand it. For centuries, the easiest explanation was also the most obvious: a long pointed object projected from the head of a large Arctic whale, so people treated it as a weapon. The resemblance was persuasive, the anatomy was not. What appears to be a horn is a tooth, an extraordinary version of the upper left canine. In most male narwhals, this single tooth develops within the upper jaw, pushes forward through the lip, and continues growing into a long counterclockwise spiral. It does not emerge from the forehead, and it is not composed of horn or bone. It is ivory, produced by the same fundamental dental tissues that form mammalian teeth. Growth begins early. At roughly 1 year of age, the developing tusk is still modest, little more than a narrow projection comparable in size to a finger. Through childhood and sexual maturation, it lengthens steadily. After roughly a decade, a large male may carry a tusk more than 10 feet long, with a base approaching 10 inches around. The structure can continue changing throughout life, preserving the history of growth in layers deposited within the tooth. Its construction changes from one end to the other. Near the skull, the interior contains a broad pulp cavity associated with living tissue. Farther outward, that space narrows as the tusk tapers, until the distant tip becomes comparatively solid. The exterior lacks the rough appearance that might be expected from such an enormous tooth. Years of exposure to seawater leave it smooth and polished, while the spiral remains visible along its entire length. Yet the most revealing clue is found not in males, but in females. Roughly 85% of female narwhals never develop an erupted tusk. Their corresponding teeth usually remain embedded within the jaw. Some males also remain tuskless. At the opposite extreme, rare males develop both upper canines, producing two spiraling tusks side by side. Females occasionally grow a tusk as well, though fewer than 15% are thought to carry one. That uneven distribution places an important boundary around any explanation of the tusk. A structure required for ordinary feeding, breathing, navigation, or survival could hardly be absent from most females. Tuskless females mature, find food, reproduce, raise calves, migrate, and survive for decades. Whatever advantages the projecting tooth provides, a narwhal can complete its life without carrying one. For nearly 2 centuries, that fact has complicated every simple interpretation. A weapon seemed plausible because males sometimes brought their tusks together. An icebreaker seemed reasonable because a pointed structure might penetrate frozen surfaces. Others imagined a rake dragged through bottom sediment or a spear used to capture fish. Herman Melville gathered several such ideas in Moby Dick, reflecting the uncertainty surrounding the animal during the 19th century. Each proposal encountered anatomical or behavioral problems. A tool essential for opening ice could not explain females thriving without it. A seafloor rake fit poorly with the way narwhals actually feed. A dedicated combat weapon seemed incomplete when serious tusk injuries were not common enough to support the image of males routinely fencing for survival. Hunting explanations remained tempting, but observations were too scarce and inconsistent to make them universal. The difficulty was never simply an absence of clues. The tusk offered too many. Its extreme length suggested display. Its sex difference suggested reproduction. Its living interior suggested functions beyond decoration. Its occasional contact with other animals suggested practical use. No single explanation comfortably contained all of those traits, so the object once mistaken for a spear became stranger when examined closely. Beneath the mythology was a tooth, but even that simple anatomical truth refused to make the narwhal simple. The oldest European explanations began with an image rather than a specimen. In 1555, Swedish historian Olaus Magnus published a vast illustrated account of northern peoples and seas. Among its creatures appeared a narwhal, transformed by distance and rumor into something more threatening, a marine beast carrying a sword-like projection from its head. To readers far from Arctic waters, the picture offered an intuitive answer. A pointed object belonged to a weapon. That interpretation endured because living narwhals occasionally seemed to confirm it. Males were seen bringing their tusks together, crossing the long spirals in movements that resembled fencing. For generations, naturalists described these encounters as contests, imagining rivals testing strength or fighting for access to females. Closer observation weakened the comparison. Tusk crossing rarely produces the injuries expected from repeated combat, and the ivory itself behaves poorly as a lance. Rather than remaining rigid under force, a long tusk can flex by roughly a foot in different directions. Such flexibility helps it survive bending, but makes it less suited to transmitting the concentrated impact expected from a dedicated stabbing weapon. Another explanation came directly from the landscape. Narwhals spend much of their lives around frozen water, and every air-breathing whale beneath ice depends on access to the surface. A forward-pointing tusk seemed perfectly placed to punch open breathing holes. The idea was elegant until behavior contradicted it. Narwhals can break thin ice using the robust forehead and upper surface of the head. Females perform the same task, despite usually carrying no erupted tusk. An adaptation supposedly essential for opening air holes could not easily depend on a structure absent from most adult females. Food inspired another possibility. Perhaps the tusk disturbed prey from the seafloor, raked through sediment, or functioned as a spear during hunting. Each version encountered the same awkward geometry. The structure extends far ahead of the mouth, limiting the close manipulation expected from a conventional feeding tool. Its great length also makes rapid, precise contact difficult to reconcile with many imagined hunting techniques. Evidence remained fragmentary, so the feeding hypothesis lingered without becoming a satisfying general explanation. Reproduction offered a stronger pattern. Large tusks occur overwhelmingly in males, immediately placing them among traits that can be shaped by sexual selection. Researchers found that males with longer tusks also tended to have larger testes, an association consistent with the tusk advertising reproductive quality. Under this interpretation, size itself could carry information. A large, well-developed tusk might signal age, condition, or fertility to potential mates and rivals without requiring violent combat. That explanation solved part of the puzzle, but not the anatomy. A display structure can become elaborate simply because reproductive competition favors it, yet the narwhal tusk contains biological complexity that ornament alone does not readily explain. Its interior is living tissue rather than inert decoration, and its relationship with the surrounding seawater demanded closer attention. Much of that hidden architecture remained poorly understood because museum ivory had already lost the living material that mattered. Harvard-affiliated researcher Dr. Martin Nguyen approached the problem differently. Working with Inuit communities and other researchers, he spent 14 years examining fresh tusks and the tissues preserved within them. Instead of asking what the tusk resembled from a distance, his work treated it as a living tooth whose microscopic structure might reveal what centuries of observation from the outside had missed. 5 centuries of interpretation had therefore moved from swords to ice picks, from feeding implements to reproductive signals, with each model capturing some visible detail and leaving another unexplained. The difficulty lay in assuming that a structure so conspicuous must reveal its purpose through appearance. The decisive evidence was smaller than anything those early illustrations could have shown, concealed inside channels running through the ivory itself. A fresh narwhal tusk looks very different under a microscope than it does behind museum glass. Once the living tissues are preserved, the ivory stops appearing like a solid ornament. It becomes a network, filled with pathways that connect the ocean outside to nerves deep within the tooth. For 14 years, Dr. Martin Nguyen worked with Inuit hunters, elders, anatomists, marine mammal researchers, and dental specialists to study that hidden structure. Fresh material mattered. A dried tusk preserved in a collection can retain its shape for centuries while losing the soft tissues needed to understand how it functioned in life. By examining specimens obtained through Inuit subsistence hunts and preserving their internal anatomy, the researchers could follow structures that ordinary museum ivory concealed. Microscopy revealed an extraordinary arrangement. Roughly 10 million nerve connections extend through the tusk, linked with microscopic channels that travel outward through dentin toward its exterior. The ivory is therefore not an impermeable wall separating the animal from seawater. Tiny pathways allow the surrounding marine environment to interact with the tooth across its surface, while sensory nerves within remain connected to the narwhal's nervous system. For a mammal, that degree of innervation makes the structure remarkable. Human fingertips achieve their sensitivity through dense concentrations of sensory receptors near the skin. The narwhal carries an elongated tooth whose exposed surface remains neurologically connected along a structure extending far beyond the mouth. Water does not merely wash across dead ivory. Changes outside the animal can reach living sensory pathways inside it. Anatomy alone could suggest sensitivity, but physiology provided stronger evidence. Researchers fitted a flexible jacket around portions of tusks on living narwhals and exposed the enclosed surface to water with different salt concentrations. The animals' heart rates changed in measurable patterns as salinity changed. When the concentration shifted, the cardiovascular response shifted with it. The tooth was participating in sensory perception. Salinity is especially meaningful in polar seas because salt alters the physical behavior of seawater. As ice forms, much of its salt is rejected into the surrounding liquid, producing local differences in concentration. Fresh water from melting ice, rivers, and glaciers creates another pattern. A narwhal capable of detecting such gradients may gain information about the water masses through which it travels, including conditions associated with freezing and melting. Temperature may also interact with this sensory landscape, but the strongest experimental evidence concerns salinity. The distinction matters because the tusk need not function like a single-purpose thermometer to provide useful environmental information. Ocean conditions are layered. Salt concentration, ice formation, freshwater input, and water movement are connected, and a sensory tooth, immersed continuously in that medium, can sample changes without requiring vision or physical contact with the ice itself. The discovery also changed the meaning of the tusk's unusual surface. What might appear imperfect from an engineering perspective, ivory penetrated by microscopic tubules rather than completely sealed against seawater, becomes useful when viewed as sensory anatomy. Permeability allows environmental changes to reach tissues capable of detecting them. The very feature that seems to expose the tooth is part of what makes perception possible. This does not reduce the tusk to one function. Biology rarely builds elaborate structures that remain confined to a single role, especially when behavior, reproduction, and sensation overlap. Yet the nerve architecture established something that centuries of speculation had missed. The tusk is alive in a more immediate sense than its polished exterior suggests. Along its spiral surface, seawater meets microscopic openings. Information passes inward, and the animal responds. What humans once handled as ivory is, on the living narwhal, part of a sensory boundary between body and ocean. Tusking can look ceremonial from a distance. Two males rise near one another, angle their heads, and bring the long spirals together. The ivory crosses, separates, and sometimes meets again, with movements controlled enough to resemble a ritual more than a collision. Early observers saw rivalry in those encounters. Modern anatomy makes the behavior harder to reduce to combat. Each participant is bringing an exceptionally sensitive tooth into contact with another. Since the tusk responds to changes in the surrounding water, researchers have considered whether tusking might involve more than dominance or display. One possibility is that contact helps males assess one another or somehow exchange information gathered through their sensory structures. Suggestions that they could compare environmental conditions, including salinity, remain intriguing but unproven. No experiment has demonstrated that one narwhal can transfer a salinity or temperature reading to another through tusk contact. What the sensory evidence changes is the range of plausible interpretations. An encounter once described as fencing can also be viewed as social investigation between animals using elaborate living structures. A different kind of evidence arrived from above. In 2025, Frontiers in Marine Science published drone observations recorded in Creswell Bay, Nunavut, during the summer of 2022. From the air, researchers could follow narwhals without placing a boat beside them, watching movements that had rarely been visible with enough detail to separate pursuit, contact, manipulation, and social interaction. The researchers identified 17 distinct behaviors across the observed sequences. Narwhals associated with one another, pursued Arctic char, investigated targets, manipulated fish, and performed actions interpreted as possible exploratory play. Some interactions appeared competitive, others potentially communicative or affiliative. The tusk was no longer behaving like an object with one fixed purpose. Its use changed with circumstance. During pursuit, that flexibility became especially clear. A narwhal could keep the tip aligned with a fast-moving Arctic char while turning sharply through shallow water. Individuals rolled partly onto their sides, redirected their heads, and followed sudden changes in the fish's path. Some turns approached a complete circle in less than 3 seconds. The long tooth, seemingly cumbersome when seen on a motionless skull, became remarkably precise when guided by the entire moving body. Contact could be delicate or forceful. Narwhals touched and manipulated fish with the tusk tip, then sometimes swept the tusk laterally with enough force to stun and perhaps kill the prey. A stunned fish became easier to capture, although success was not guaranteed. Glaucous gulls circling above repeatedly entered the same contest, diving toward fish pursued by the whales and attempting to steal an opportunity created below. Their interference reduced the narwhal's chances of securing prey, turning a brief hunt into an interaction among whale, fish, and bird. The observations also contained behavior without an obvious immediate reward. Researchers described exploratory object play, including tusk interactions that did not fit neatly into feeding or aggression. Such moments matter because multifunctional anatomy often acquires uses beyond the evolutionary pressure that originally shaped it. That leaves tusking in a more interesting scientific position than the old image of males simply crossing weapons. Sexual selection still has strong evidence behind it, and displays between males may help communicate size, condition, or status. Sensory function is real. Hunting use is directly observed. Social and exploratory uses are now documented as well. The narwhal carries one structure into many parts of its life. The spiral can receive information, advertise the animal carrying it, touch another narwhal, investigate an unfamiliar object, and strike moving prey. Its meaning changes with the behavior around it, not because the evidence is contradictory, but because living anatomy rarely obeys the simple categories humans first assigned to it. Ivory grows slowly enough to remember. Inside a narwhal tusk, material laid down during 1 year remains beside the material formed during the next, creating successive growth layers that can be read long after the animal has died. The spiral is therefore more than anatomy in the present. It contains a chemical chronology of where one whale fed, what entered its body, and how the Arctic around it changed during a lifetime. Researchers from Aarhus University, McGill University, and the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources used this chronology by cutting tusks lengthwise and sampling individual growth layers. Each layer contained chemical signatures incorporated while the tooth was forming. Because those layers accumulate through time, scientists could connect measurements from different positions along the tusk with different periods in the animal's life. Among the most revealing signals were stable forms of carbon and nitrogen. Carbon isotope patterns can reflect the habitats and food webs supporting an animal's prey, including changes associated with feeding near sea ice or in more open water. Nitrogen isotope patterns help indicate trophic position, revealing shifts in how high within the food web the narwhal was feeding. Together, these chemical traces preserve changes that would be impossible to reconstruct from a single stomach sample taken at death. Mercury added another history. The metal enters northern marine food webs and becomes concentrated as predators consume contaminated prey. By measuring mercury through successive tusk layers, researchers could follow exposure across decades rather than seeing only the concentration present near the end of life. The record showed that environmental contamination and changes in diet could be separated and compared across time, allowing the animal's own tissues to preserve evidence of forces operating far beyond its body. For a narwhal reaching 50 years of age, the sequence can span half a century. A tusk from an animal born in the 1960s may contain annual material formed through the 1970s, 1980s, and later decades, covering years when direct observations of the high Arctic were far more limited than they are today. Modern satellites can watch ice from orbit, but they cannot travel backward. Old biological material can. That makes historical collections unexpectedly valuable. Museums across Europe and North America hold tusks acquired generations ago, many collected before systematic Arctic monitoring existed. Some were preserved as curiosities, trophies, trade objects, or examples of natural history. Their original collectors could not have known that future laboratories would be capable of reading isotopes and contaminants from the layers within them. Professor Rune Dietz, one of the researchers involved in this work, has described museum tusks as a bank of data. The phrase is unusually literal. Every preserved specimen may contain deposits made during environmental conditions, no instrument recorded directly. When tusks from different animals, regions, and generations are compared, separate lifetimes can begin forming a longer chronology of ecological change. There are limits to what such records can say. Chemistry does not provide a daily travel diary, and a growth layer cannot identify every fish consumed or every channel crossed. Interpretation depends on understanding food webs, contaminant pathways, age, location, and the way tissues incorporate chemical elements. Yet those constraints do not diminish the archive. They define how carefully it must be read. A narwhal carries its surroundings into its growing tooth year after year. Prey leaves a signature. Pollution leaves another. Shifts between ice-associated and open water feeding can leave traces of their own. Long after the animal's movements have ended, those layers remain arranged in sequence, preserving an Arctic lifetime as physical matter. The tusk does not merely grow through time. Time becomes part of the tusk. A straight tusk would seem simpler to grow. The narwhal does something more elaborate. From its base to its narrowing tip, the tooth turns around its own axis in a remarkably regular helix, producing the groove that has made narwhal ivory recognizable for centuries. Almost every normally developed tusk follows the same handedness, revealing that the twist is part of the animal's developmental pattern rather than an accident of growth. Viewed from the tip toward the head, the spiral runs counterclockwise. That consistency persists across individuals separated by enormous distances and generations. Even the rare male carrying two erupted tusks generally shows the characteristic spiral in both. The right canine does not simply become a reversed counterpart of the left. It follows the same basic rotational pattern, suggesting that the direction emerges from biological instructions governing tooth development. Growth itself helps create the form. New dentin is deposited through the living tooth as the tusk lengthens, while different regions develop under slightly different rates and mechanical conditions. Instead of producing a perfectly straight cylinder, this coordinated growth generates the familiar helical geometry. The result is not merely decorative. Shape influences how a long biological structure responds when forces act upon it. A projecting tooth experiences bending from water resistance, contact with objects, interactions with other narwhals, and ordinary movement of the head. If stress were concentrated repeatedly along one side, microscopic damage could accumulate. The spiral geometry, combined with the tusk's layered composition, helps distribute mechanical loads through the structure rather than confining them to a single line. This contributes to an unusual balance between stiffness and flexibility. A large tusk can flex substantially without immediately fracturing, with movement approaching 12 inches under some conditions. That resilience comes from more than the visible twist. Materials researchers describe narwhal ivory as hierarchical, meaning its organization changes across multiple scales. Mineral crystals and organic components form dentin. Microscopic tubules pass through that tissue. Larger layers develop around the central pulp region, and the entire arrangement continues outward into the macroscopic spiral. Strength emerges from these levels, working together rather than from simple hardness. Such architecture matters because hardness alone can make a material brittle. The narwhal tusk must remain strong enough to project several feet beyond the body while tolerating repeated bending throughout decades of life. Its composition allows small amounts of deformation to occur without forcing every strain directly toward a catastrophic break. In engineering terms, it combines properties that are often difficult to achieve simultaneously in a long, slender structure. Genetics clearly influences whether tusks develop, although the inheritance is more complicated than a single dominant tusk gene. Narwhals and belugas share relatively recent ancestry, yet their dental development follows strikingly different paths. Rare hybrids between them can produce unusual tooth arrangements, showing how inherited developmental programs can interact in unexpected ways. Those hybrids are valuable precisely because they resist simple genetic explanations. The spiral itself has attracted interest beyond marine biology. Materials scientists study natural structures like tusks because evolution has spent immense spans of time producing solutions to recurring mechanical problems. A biological material grows without a factory, repairs and develops through living tissue, combines mineral and organic components, and can achieve useful strength without becoming completely rigid. In the narwhal, that engineering is written into a curve repeated from one generation to another. The tooth does not simply extend outward. It grows while turning, building resilience into geometry, until an ordinary canine has become one of the most distinctive structures produced by any mammal. Winter changes the narwhal's world vertically. When broad reaches of Arctic water close beneath ice, the whales remain within the frozen seascape, but much of their food lies far below it. Survival becomes a repeated journey between a narrow opportunity to breathe and feeding grounds thousands of feet beneath the surface. Greenland halibut dominate the winter diet in important narwhal wintering areas. These flattened fish occupy deep waters near the seafloor, commonly between roughly 2,600 and 4,900 feet. Reaching them requires a descent comparable to dropping through hundreds of building stories, except the narwhal must make the entire passage on a limited store of oxygen and return to air afterward. Some dives extend much farther. Instrumented narwhals have been recorded descending to about 7,780 feet, approaching 1.5 miles beneath the surface. The deepest Mediterranean trenches descend beyond 17,000 feet, so the whale is not approaching an oceanic limit. Its achievement lies elsewhere. Few air-breathing mammals routinely enter such depths while continuing to forage as part of ordinary winter life. A winter day can contain between 10 and 25 deep dives. Many last around 20 to 25 minutes, placing a remarkable portion of the animal's time below the upper ocean. Surface intervals become brief periods for respiration before another descent begins. Movement is carefully economical. After leaving the surface, a narwhal strokes to establish downward momentum, then increasingly uses gliding as depth increases. Buoyancy changes as pressure compresses air spaces within the body, allowing gravity and reduced buoyant resistance to assist the descent. Every interval spent gliding reduces muscular work, preserving oxygen that will matter during hunting and ascent. Light disappears early in comparison with the total distance. By roughly 800 feet, useful sunlight has largely vanished from these Arctic waters. At 3,000 feet, the surface belongs to another physical realm, separated by an immense column of water. Vision contributes little to locating prey. Sound becomes the workable map, with returning echoes carrying information about targets and surroundings that the eyes cannot provide. Pressure grows continuously. At 4,900 feet, the surrounding water exerts more than 150 times normal atmospheric pressure. Any rigid air-filled cavity would face enormous stress. The narwhal survives because its body does not resist compression in the way an ordinary sealed vessel would. Air spaces change, tissues tolerate pressure, and the chest can yield rather than attempting to remain fixed against the weight outside. Temperature adds another constraint. Deep winter water remains near 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that an unprotected mammal would lose heat rapidly. Yet the narwhal must preserve warmth, while simultaneously rationing oxygen, navigating, finding prey, and eventually reversing direction. The ascent demands a different mechanical strategy. A descending whale can exploit negative buoyancy and glide, but returning toward the surface requires sustained propulsion. Tail strokes become more important as the animal climbs, precisely when its stored oxygen has already been partly consumed. The final portion of the dive therefore combines increasing buoyancy with active swimming, carrying the whale back toward its next breath. This cycle is not an occasional feat reserved for unusual circumstances. During winter feeding, it may happen 15 times in a single day, sometimes more. Each descent passes from icebound surface water into darkness through rising pressure and diminishing oxygen reserves toward fish living near the bottom. Then the direction reverses. Thousands of feet are recovered, the surface is reached, air enters the lungs, and the vertical rhythm begins again. The narwhal's deepest dives are governed by a rhythm that would look almost incompatible with exertion in most mammals. As the animal submerges, its circulation begins changing before the greatest pressures arrive. The response is automatic, inherited from the mammalian diving reflex. But in this Arctic whale, it operates at an extraordinary extreme. Blood vessels supplying the skin, outer tissues, and less immediately essential organs constrict. This process, known as peripheral vasoconstriction, reduces circulation through regions that can temporarily tolerate receiving less oxygen. Blood remains preferentially available to organs that cannot endure interruption, especially the brain and heart. Oxygen stored in the blood and muscles is rationed across the dive rather than spent at the rate expected during ordinary swimming. The heart participates by slowing. Researchers working with narwhals in East Greenland attached instruments capable of recording cardiac activity alongside depth and body movement while the animals swam freely. These measurements provided an unusually intimate view of a whale's cardiovascular system functioning during natural dives rather than inside a controlled enclosure. Near the surface, cardiac rhythm remains comparatively rapid. With increasing depth, the intervals between contractions lengthen. During especially deep portions of dives, recorded rates have fallen below 4 beats per minute. A sleeping human heart commonly contracts around 60 to 70 times each minute. The narwhal can descend into a physiological state where many seconds pass between individual heartbeats while its brain remains functioning and its body remains capable of coordinated movement. Bradycardia, the scientific term for an unusually slow heart rate, is expected in diving mammals. Slowing circulation conserves oxygen. The puzzle appears when the whale begins working harder. During active swimming, muscles normally demand increased oxygen delivery, and mammalian hearts ordinarily respond by beating faster. Narwhals can do something very different. Their stroke frequency can rise to more than 25 tail movements per minute, while cardiac activity remains profoundly suppressed. Exercise and oxygen conservation occur together, producing signals that seem physiologically opposed. Comparable combinations have troubling consequences in laboratory mammals. Experiments involving rats have shown that intense activity, layered onto strong fear-related or diving-related, bradycardia can destabilize the electrical rhythm of the heart, creating arrhythmias and sometimes sudden cardiac death. Narwhals repeatedly tolerate conditions containing elements of that same conflict without routinely collapsing. Part of the explanation lies in their exceptional adaptation to oxygen management. Their tissues store substantial oxygen before submergence, and circulation can be redistributed with remarkable precision. Yet, those adaptations do not completely explain how electrical stability is maintained when muscular effort rises while the heart remains so slow. Researchers can measure the contradiction more easily than they can account for every mechanism protecting the animal from it. The brain presents another constraint. Neural tissue is highly sensitive to oxygen shortage, so blood supply cannot simply be reduced everywhere equally. The heart itself also requires oxygen while operating under unusual pressure, altered circulation, and changing demands from the rest of the body. Somehow, these organs continue functioning through repeated cycles that would place severe strain on less specialized mammals. There is no moment when the narwhal consciously chooses this arrangement. The response unfolds through autonomic control, adjusting heartbeat, vessel diameter, and oxygen distribution as depth and activity change. Millions of years of selection have shaped a cardiovascular system capable of entering states that remain difficult to reproduce safely elsewhere. At depth, the paradox can be heard in the numbers alone. The tail continues working. The brain continues navigating. Between them, the heart waits through long intervals, contracts once, then waits again, sustaining a living body on a rhythm close to stillness. A deep-diving narwhal carries its oxygen in places that cannot be crushed. Much of the reserve is not held in the lungs at all, but bound inside blood and muscle, where pressure cannot squeeze it away. The body entering the deep is therefore less like a swimmer holding one enormous breath, and more like a living network of oxygen stores, each drawn upon as the descent continues. Within the muscles, one of the most important stores is myoglobin, a protein that binds oxygen and keeps it available directly where movement requires it. Diving mammals possess unusually high concentrations of myoglobin, and narwhals belong among the specialists. Their working muscles can hold substantial oxygen locally, reducing their dependence on a continuous supply arriving from the lungs. The dark pigmentation associated with dense myoglobin gives deep diving muscle a much deeper color than the flesh of many land mammals. Pressure demands a different kind of adaptation. A human chest is built around ribs that resist deformation, but a diving whale benefits from yielding. Flexible connections in the thorax allow the chest to compress as surrounding pressure rises. At the same time, the lungs and smaller airways can collapse in a controlled manner. Air is displaced away from delicate gas-exchanging regions, limiting continued transfer of nitrogen into the bloodstream as the whale goes deeper. This does not make decompression sickness impossible. Diving mammals can still accumulate nitrogen and can show gas bubbles under some circumstances. What controlled lung collapse provides is protection, reducing nitrogen uptake during the deepest portion of a dive and lowering the danger created by repeated pressure changes. The whale survives not by remaining rigid against the ocean, but by allowing parts of its respiratory system to change shape with it. Cold creates another demand. Beneath the skin lies a thick mantle of blubber, an energy reserve and thermal barrier wrapped around the body. Narwhals can carry an exceptionally substantial blubber layer, especially as winter approaches. Heat produced in the core is conserved while blood flow near the exterior can be regulated, slowing the transfer of warmth into surrounding water. The same tissue stores energy for seasons when feeding opportunities and travel costs change. External shape contributes in smaller ways. The absence of a tall dorsal fin leaves the back low and smooth, reducing exposed surface and allowing the animal to pass beneath irregular ice. During steep changes in depth, that compact profile also avoids an appendage that would add drag without contributing much propulsion. The broad tail provides thrust, while the body remains rounded and efficient. Feeding anatomy follows its own unusual economy. Narwhals possess only vestigial teeth inside the mouth and cannot process prey through conventional chewing. Instead, movements of the tongue and throat generate suction that draws fish and squid inward. Food can be swallowed whole, eliminating the need for a heavy arrangement of grasping and crushing teeth. The skull remains specialized around sound production, suction feeding, and the peculiar dental development that produces the tusk. None of these features works alone. Myoglobin extends the usable oxygen supply. Blood carries another reserve. Flexible air spaces accommodate pressure. Controlled lung collapse limits gas exchange at depth. Blubber slows heat loss. Streamlined anatomy reduces unnecessary resistance, and suction feeding allows prey to be taken without chewing. Together, they form a body shaped around repetition. The narwhal does not merely survive one exceptional plunge. Through the winter, it must perform deep dives again and again, recovering between them, preserving heat, managing gases, feeding, and restoring oxygen before descending once more. Its anatomy is built not simply to reach the abyss, but to make that extreme journey part of an ordinary day. At 4,900 feet, vision has almost no role left to play. A narwhal searching for prey is surrounded by water beyond the reach of sunlight, yet the space ahead is not empty to its senses. Each movement can be accompanied by a stream of clicks, and every returning echo adds shape to a world assembled through sound. Narwhals belong to the toothed whales, a lineage whose members use echolocation. Their clicks are generated within the head and shaped by the melon, a mass of specialized fatty tissue in the forehead. Rather than releasing sound equally in every direction, this structure helps focus acoustic energy forward. The outgoing pulse travels through seawater, strikes fish, ice, or another surface, then returns carrying information about distance, position, movement, and physical structure. Their acoustic range is remarkable. Narwhal clicks can extend from roughly 2 kHz to beyond 200 kHz, reaching frequencies far above the upper boundary of human hearing. Recordings from winter feeding grounds have detected clicks exceeding 200 kilohertz during deep foraging. Such high frequencies have short wavelengths, allowing echoes to preserve fine spatial detail, although higher frequency sound also fades more rapidly with distance. What distinguishes the narwhal most strongly is the shape of its acoustic beam. Field measurements published in the journal Public Library of Science 1 found an exceptionally narrow and directional echolocation field, described by researchers as among the most focused measured in an echolocating animal. Instead of flooding a broad volume of water with every pulse, the narwhal can concentrate acoustic energy toward a comparatively small region ahead. That precision becomes especially useful during the final approach to prey. As a target is located, individual clicks begin arriving faster. The intervals shrink until the sequence becomes an echolocation buzz, a rapid series of signals that continually updates the animal as prey changes direction. Hundreds of acoustic samples can be produced within a short span, giving the narwhal fresh information while distance closes and movements become increasingly important. The beam itself is not necessarily fixed at one width. Evidence from toothed whales, including narwhals, indicates that acoustic focusing can change with context. A broader field can help examine more of the surroundings, while tighter focusing concentrates attention toward a particular target. The animal is therefore not merely listening for echoes. It is actively shaping the sound it sends into the water according to the task before it. Hunting is only part of the problem solved by this sensory system. Winter sea ice can cover immense areas of the narwhal's habitat, leaving access to air restricted to leads, fractures, and openings scattered across the frozen surface. An ascending whale must distinguish the geometry overhead and orient toward places where surfacing remains possible. Echoes returning from ice provide information unavailable through vision long before the animal reaches it. Sound travels through seawater far more effectively than light, and the narwhal has evolved around that physical advantage. Researchers have compared these whales to wet bats, not because their environments resemble one another, but because evolution arrived at a related solution in two very different worlds. The comparison becomes more striking because water is roughly 1,000 times denser than air, changing both the transmission of sound and the anatomy required to control it. Within that medium, the narwhal's narrow beam functions almost like an acoustic spotlight, illuminating nothing to the eye while resolving what lies ahead. Bats interrogate air with sound. Narwhals do the same in dense seawater, under immense pressure, turning brief pulses and returning echoes into an acoustic landscape detailed enough to hunt, navigate, and find a path back to air. Winter feeding leaves little room for wasted movement. Far beneath the ice, narwhals descend toward places where Greenland halibut gather close to the seafloor, concentrated across wintering grounds that can lie between 2,600 and 4,900 feet below the surface. These flatfish provide much of the reason for repeated deep dives during the coldest months. The whales are not simply visiting depth, they are following food into the layer where it becomes abundant. Greenland halibut spend much of their lives near the bottom, their flattened bodies suited to a world of sediment and dim water. A narwhal approaching one does not have the jaws of a seal or the gripping teeth of a dolphin. Its functional dentition has taken an unusual evolutionary path, leaving the mouth without a conventional set of teeth for seizing, cutting, or grinding prey. Once a fish has been located, another mechanism must bring it inside. The answer is suction. By rapidly changing the volume inside the mouth and throat, a narwhal creates a pressure difference that draws water and prey inward. Its flexible lips help control the opening, while muscular structures farther back generate the pull. A halibut weighing several pounds can disappear into the mouth hole without being bitten into pieces. The fish passes toward the esophagus largely intact, turning feeding into an act of precise positioning rather than chewing. At depth, that precision begins before the mouth opens. Echolocation guides the whale toward an individual target lying near the bottom. As distance closes, the narwhal must orient its head, control its speed, and enter effective suction range without burying its face in sediment or losing the fish. The final movement can be remarkably economical. Sound identifies the prey, the body approaches, pressure changes inside the mouth, and the fish is drawn away from the seafloor in one continuous sequence. Halibut dominate much of the winter menu, but narwhals are not bound to a single prey species. Arctic cod and polar cod also appear in their diet, with polar cod occurring at depths beyond 1,600 feet. Boreoatlantic armhook, squid, and shrimp add other forms of prey, each presenting different movements, body shapes, and positions in the water. What a narwhal eats changes with season and location because the Arctic food web itself shifts through the year. Summer brings a different pattern. Cod become more accessible in shallower waters, while feeding intensity generally declines compared with winter. Energy and time are distributed among migration, social activity, and the demands surrounding calves. The seasonal contrast is striking because winter, despite its harsher conditions, can become the principal period for intensive feeding. Deep water holds the concentrated resource, and the narwhals repeatedly travel down to harvest it. Each successful capture replaces energy spent swimming, maintaining body heat, and returning through thousands of feet of water toward the surface above. Observations made from drones in 2025 complicated the picture further. Near the surface, researchers recorded narwhals pursuing Arctic char and using their tusks in direct contact with the fish. Rather than relying only on suction at the final instant, the whales tracked moving char, struck them with controlled tusk movements, and stunned them before collecting the prey. That behavior reveals a flexibility hidden by the toothless mouth. Against halibut near the bottom, the narwhal can become a carefully positioned suction feeder. Against swift fish nearer the surface, it can pursue, strike, and then consume. Its feeding anatomy may appear specialized, yet its hunting behavior remains adaptable, shaped by whatever prey occupies the water around it. Predation changes the narwhal before an attacker ever reaches it. A distant sound can alter movement, breathing, heart rhythm, and the decision to remain visible at the surface. In the Arctic, two hunters have shaped this response across generations. Polar bears can seize narwhals where breathing openings restrict their movement. But the predator capable of pursuing them through open water is the orca, a social hunter whose arrival can transform the behavior of an entire pod. Orcas hunt cooperatively. Several individuals can approach together, divide a group, and pressure selected narwhals away from companions. Near broken ice, the geometry becomes especially important. Narwhals can enter dense ice that larger orcas may avoid, yet reaching that refuge requires distance and time. When escape routes narrow, coordinated pursuit can force a whale toward places where maneuvering becomes difficult. The narwhal's defense is therefore not built around confronting the predator. It depends on becoming difficult to locate and difficult to follow. Acoustic observations have revealed one of the strangest parts of that strategy. When narwhals detect nearby orcas, their ordinary vocal activity can collapse. Clicks and calls diminish as the whales reduce the sounds that might reveal their position. Movement can also become restrained before they descend, producing a freeze response more familiar from prey animals on land. The animal that normally reads its surroundings through sound may suppress its own acoustic presence when another hunter is listening. That response reaches deeper than behavior. In 2017, researchers reported physiological measurements from narwhals captured temporarily in nets in East Greenland and then released with monitoring equipment attached. Their escape produced an unusual combination. The whales accelerated their swimming, sometimes exceeding 25 tail strokes per minute, while their hearts slowed dramatically. During portions of the response, heart rate fell below 4 beats per minute. Ordinarily, strenuous exercise demands faster circulation. Muscles consume oxygen more rapidly, and the cardiovascular system responds by increasing delivery. Fear can also alter heart rhythm. Yet the narwhal combined intense muscular work with profound bradycardia, the slowing of the heartbeat associated with conserving oxygen during diving. Two commands seem to occupy the body at once: move with urgency while preserving the cardiovascular pattern of a deep descent. Experiments in other mammals have shown how dangerous such conflicting signals can become. In rats, severe bradycardia combined with intense activity and fear can contribute to abnormal heart rhythms and sudden cardiac death. Narwhals somehow endure a comparable physiological conflict during natural escape responses. Researchers still do not fully understand how blood flow remains adequate to the brain and working muscles, or how the heart avoids destabilizing electrical rhythms while beating so infrequently. The origin of this response may lie in an older Arctic danger. Narwhals sometimes become trapped when shifting ice closes around limited openings, events known in Greenlandic as savsat. Large numbers can gather around the remaining access to air, sometimes for prolonged periods, with open water shrinking beneath surrounding ice. In such conditions, unnecessary movement can consume oxygen without creating an escape route. Across evolutionary time, restraint during threat may have favored animals that conserved oxygen, reduced detectable movement, and waited rather than fleeing continuously. Modern disturbance can trigger parts of machinery shaped for predators and ice. Ship engines introduce powerful, unfamiliar sound into waters where narwhals depend heavily on acoustic information. A response that once reduced detection by orcas may become costly when the source cannot hunt, tire, or behave like a predator. The narwhal may still descend, suppress sound, and alter its heartbeat because its nervous system is responding with an ancient pattern, carried into an Arctic where some of the loudest approaching things are no longer alive. A savsat begins with geography turning against the animals inside it. A bay, inlet, or narrow passage may remain navigable until a sudden change in weather drives rapid ice formation across its exits. Narwhals that entered through open water can find the route behind them closed. What had been a feeding ground or migration corridor becomes a chamber roofed with ice, and survival contracts to the scattered places where seawater still touches the air. The whales gather at cracks and openings, returning repeatedly to breathe. Their rounded foreheads carry thick connective tissue that can help break thin ice and keep small holes usable. Yet, every opening has limits. Falling temperatures build new ice around its edges, while wind and currents shift surrounding flows into tighter arrangements. A breathing hole can narrow from many feet across to a confined patch occupied by dozens or hundreds of bodies. Each breath then depends on reaching the same diminishing space. Greenlandic speakers gave these entrapments the name savsat, and Inuit communities have recognized them for generations. They are part of Arctic natural history, not a phenomenon created by modern industry. Ice has always moved unpredictably enough to imprison whales. Knowledge of these events became part of living alongside narwhals because an entrapment could suddenly concentrate enormous numbers of animals in one place, changing both the ecology of a bay and the opportunities available to hunters. The concentration also attracts polar bears. A bear waiting beside an opening does not need to pursue a narwhal through water. The whales must eventually surface where air remains accessible, placing predator and prey along the same narrow boundary. Beneath them, crowding creates another danger. If the opening closes completely, there is nowhere else to breathe. Animals capable of extraordinary dives can survive prolonged periods below the surface, but no diving adaptation can replace atmospheric oxygen indefinitely. One of the most extensively described historical events occurred in Disko Bay, Greenland, in February 1915. Morten Porsild, director of the Danish Arctic Station, documented 2 entrapments occurring during the same winter. His estimate placed the number of dead narwhals above 1,000. The scale revealed how an event created by ordinary freezing conditions could remove a substantial concentration of whales within a short period, leaving tusks and bodies beneath a landscape that soon appeared frozen again. Nearly a century later, aerial observations recorded another large entrapment near Pond Inlet in Canada. In 2008, hundreds of narwhals were confined to a shrinking opening. Seen from above, the remaining water was crowded with backs and tusks, oriented in different directions, each animal converging on the same access to air. The geometry made the problem visible in a way written accounts could not. Open water was not merely habitat there, it was a finite resource becoming smaller around living bodies. That episode did not stand alone. Between 2008 and 2010, 4 entrapment events were reported across Canada and Greenland, some in places without previously documented SAVSATs. Such records do not mean entrapment itself is new. They point instead toward a changing difficulty in predicting where dangerous ice conditions may develop. Narwhals evolved amid shifting ice, and generations have been filtered through winters in which some routes remained open while others vanished. A response shaped under those conditions can persist because the Arctic has never offered certainty. What has altered is the rhythm of that uncertainty. Freeze timing, ice movement, and seasonal stability are changing unevenly across regions, making old patterns less dependable. The SAVSAT remains an ancient Arctic event, but the map of where and when it can happen has become harder to read. A population can carry the memory of catastrophe without preserving a single wound on any living body. In narwhals, that memory lies inside the genome. When researchers examined genetic material from animals across the Arctic, they found remarkably little variation from one individual to another. For a species numbering well above 100,000 animals, the narrowness of that genetic inheritance was unexpected. Genetic diversity accumulates as mutations arise and lineages separate across generations. Large, stable populations usually preserve many versions of genes, creating a broad reservoir of biological variation. Narwhals possess far less of that reservoir than their present abundance might suggest. Whole genome analyses indicate that their low diversity is ancient rather than simply the result of recent hunting or modern environmental pressure. Somewhere deep in their history, their ancestral population passed through prolonged periods when comparatively few breeding animals contributed to future generations. Such contractions are known as population bottlenecks. When numbers fall severely, entire genetic lineages disappear. Even if the population later recovers, lost variants do not simply return. Descendants inherit whatever remained among the survivors, carrying a reduced genetic library into every generation that follows. For narwhals, genomic studies suggest a long history of low effective population size, extending through major climatic changes of the Pleistocene. Ice may have played an important role in that history. During Pleistocene glacial cycles, Arctic habitats repeatedly expanded, contracted, and reorganized. Narwhals would have faced changing migration corridors, prey distributions, and access to breathing areas. Researchers, including Kristen Ladry of the University of Washington, have studied how tightly the species is bound to sea ice, while genetic work has raised the possibility that ancient environmental pressures repeatedly restricted narwhal populations. Large entrapments offer one plausible mechanism, although the exact causes of the ancient genetic decline cannot be reconstructed with certainty. What survived those contractions was extraordinarily specialized. The modern narwhal occupies an ecological niche that demands precise timing, physiology, migration, and use of seasonal ice. Low diversity has not prevented the species from persisting or becoming abundant again. A narrow gene pool is therefore not the same thing as immediate genetic collapse. Narwhals demonstrate that a species can remain viable for immense spans of time despite carrying relatively little variation. The difficulty appears when the pace of environmental change accelerates. Genetic variation supplies natural selection with alternatives. When conditions shift, some individuals may possess inherited traits that perform better under the new circumstances, allowing those variants to spread through later generations. With fewer alternatives available, the range of possible biological responses can be smaller. Adaptation still occurs, but the raw material on which selection acts is more limited. That distinction matters in an Arctic transforming within decades rather than across the long intervals of past glacial cycles. Sea ice now forms later in many regions, retreats earlier, and varies more strongly from year to year. Prey communities can shift with changing water conditions, while new competitors, predators, vessels, and sources of underwater disturbance enter habitats that were once protected by persistent ice. The genetic record does not predict extinction, and low diversity alone cannot determine the narwhal's future. It reveals something subtler. This species has already endured profound environmental narrowing, and its descendants still carry the molecular signature of those ancient contractions. Narwhals emerged from that history exquisitely matched to a frozen world. Their deeper ancestry reaches back through toothed whales that evolved under far different climatic conditions long before the modern Arctic ecosystem took shape. Over evolutionary time, the narwhal lineage became increasingly bound to cold water and seasonal ice. The result is an animal refined around conditions that are now changing faster than its genome has encountered in recent evolutionary history. The old bottleneck remains written within its cells, while the environment around those cells is being rewritten. The narwhal's oldest story begins far from the frozen seas that now define it. Millions of years before its descendants moved beneath Arctic ice, members of its broader family inhabited waters where winters were gentler and the ocean belonged to a very different world. Evolution did not create the narwhal for ice in a single transformation. It shaped the animal gradually, following climates that changed around it. Narwhals and belugas share an ancient branch of the toothed whale family tree. Genetic evidence places their divergence roughly 11 to 15 million years ago during the Miocene, when northern climates were generally warmer than those of the modern Arctic. From that shared ancestry, the two lineages began accumulating different adaptations while remaining close enough that their relationship is still unmistakable in anatomy and genetics. Fossils add unexpected geography to this history. Bohaskaya monodontoides, an extinct relative known from deposits in what is now Virginia, lived during the Pliocene and possessed features linking it to the family that contains narwhals and belugas. More striking still is Casatia thermophila. Its fossil remains were recovered from Tuscany, Italy, in sediments laid down roughly 5 million years ago. A relative of today's Arctic whales had once inhabited warm waters of the ancient Mediterranean region. That discovery changes the apparent direction of the narwhal story. Cold was not the ancestral condition. The lineage entered increasingly northern environments as global climate cooled and northern ice became more extensive. Across generations, individuals better suited to colder water, seasonal ice, prolonged diving, and irregular access to air left descendants carrying those advantages. What began as ordinary variation became specialization written into anatomy and metabolism. The genome preserves traces of that long refinement. Researchers comparing narwhal genes with those of other mammals have identified evolutionary changes associated with lipid metabolism, the processing and storage of fats that matter greatly in a cold marine environment. Other genetic signals involve responses to low oxygen, fitting an animal whose life eventually became tied to prolonged dives. These adaptations did not appear because evolution anticipated an Arctic future. Each spread because it helped animals survive conditions already pressing upon them. Belugas traveled along a related evolutionary road without narrowing their lives quite as severely. They occupy Arctic and subarctic waters, enter estuaries and rivers, consume a broad range of prey, and use habitats that vary considerably through the year. Narwhals became more closely bound to deep offshore basins and heavy seasonal ice. Their range contracted into a more specialized ecological world, even as their bodies became exceptionally effective within it. The difference is a reminder that specialization carries no intention. Natural selection rewards what works under existing conditions. Over immense spans of time, the narwhal lineage accumulated traits suited to cold water, deep diving, concentrated winter feeding grounds, and landscapes of moving ice. Success within that environment gradually made the animal dependent upon its particular structure. Its scientific name, Monodon monoceros, reaches back to Greek roots, meaning one tooth and one horn, an old description of the feature humans noticed first. Yet the deeper distinction lies in the lineage itself. The modern narwhal is the only living species of its genus. Extinct relatives survive only as fragments in stone, while the beluga remains its closest living relation. What swims beneath northern ice today is therefore not an animal born from an eternally frozen ancestry. It is the surviving endpoint of a warm water lineage that followed a cooling planet northward and changed with it. Across millions of years, the environment and the animal became increasingly fitted to one another until a former inhabitant of temperate seas became one of the ocean's most specialized creatures of ice. For centuries, one of Europe's most valuable animal products arrived without the animal attached. Long, pale, spiraled tusks traveled south from Arctic waters into royal courts, church treasuries, apothecaries, and collections of wonders. Their origin remained distant enough to invite another explanation. To buyers who had never seen a narwhal, these were not unusual teeth from northern Wales. They were the horns of unicorns. Norse Greenlanders participated in the medieval trade that carried narwhal ivory into Europe, obtaining tusks through Arctic hunting and exchange networks that connected communities across Greenland and the northern seas. Once transported beyond the regions where narwhals lived, the tusk entered a culture already prepared to believe in unicorns. Medieval bestiaries described the creature. Religious symbolism gave it purity and spiritual meaning. A real spiral of ivory seemed to provide physical evidence. Europeans called the supposed substance alicorn. Its value came from more than rarity. Alicorn was credited with detecting or neutralizing poison, purifying contaminated water, treating illness, and easing melancholia. Wealthy households sometimes fashioned pieces into drinking vessels or ceremonial objects, trusting that contact with the material could make dangerous substances harmless. Powder scraped from a tusk could become medicine. Entire specimens became demonstrations of status, faith, and access to distant marvels. That belief transformed narwhal ivory into an extraordinary commodity. Tusks could command prices exceeding their weight in gold, placing Arctic hunters and northern merchants at one end of a trade whose richest customers occupied palaces thousands of miles away. The geography itself protected the story. Few European buyers could travel far enough north to encounter a living narwhal, and fewer still possessed reliable natural histories capable of identifying what they had purchased. Royal collections absorbed some of the finest examples. Queen Elizabeth I of England possessed a narwhal tusk traditionally valued at approximately £10,000 in 16th century currency, a sum associated with the cost of an entire castle. Such an object was not merely decoration. In a court where poisoning remained a feared possibility, the supposed protective properties of a unicorn horn could make ownership seem practical as well as prestigious. Church treasuries also preserved narwhal ivory among sacred and precious objects. Farther north, Danish royalty turned the material into something even more permanent. The coronation chair used by Denmark's absolute monarchs was constructed largely from narwhal tusks, their pale spirals incorporated into a throne designed to embody royal authority. By then, the Arctic tooth had crossed from natural object into political symbol. Examples remain in museums today. The Metropolitan Museum of Art preserves narwhal ivory within the collections associated with the cloisters, where surviving objects reveal how readily unusual natural materials could acquire meanings disconnected from their biological origins. A tusk displayed in Europe could support an entire imagined creature precisely because almost nobody viewing it had access to the living source. The illusion weakened as exploration, anatomical study, and expanding knowledge of northern wildlife connected the tusk to the narwhal. The unicorn did not vanish from art or folklore, but its most convincing piece of physical evidence acquired a different identity. What had crossed Europe as a magical horn was an elongated tooth from a whale. Its spiral had been real, its rarity had been real, and the animal producing it had been real. Only the creature Europeans built around the ivory belonged to imagination. For generations, distance had supplied everything the story needed. By the time the narwhal's ivory reached the highest chambers of European power, the mythology surrounding it had become more than folklore. A substance believed to come from a creature of perfect purity could become medicine, protection, religious symbolism, and royal authority at once. The animal itself remained beyond European experience, while its tooth entered rooms where decisions affecting kingdoms were made. In 1671, Denmark transformed that mythology into furniture. A coronation chair commissioned for the Danish monarchy was constructed largely from narwhal tusks, with long sections of ivory forming its pale framework. Later known as the Rosenborg throne, it became a ceremonial seat for Denmark's absolute monarchs. The material mattered. A king seated among supposed unicorn horns was surrounded by objects associated with rarity, purity, supernatural protection, and legitimate power. Elsewhere, smaller pieces disappeared into medicine. Apothecaries scraped and ground narwhal ivory into powder, then sold preparations intended to counter poison, plague, fever, and other illnesses. The belief had practical consequences inside royal households, where poisoning was considered a genuine political danger. Material identified as unicorn horn could be added to food or drink, incorporated into remedies, or kept nearby as protection against an assassin's cup. Popes, princes, and wealthy nobles participated in a medical culture where rarity often strengthened credibility. The tusk's enormous cost helped reinforce its reputation. Something obtained from the farthest edge of the known world, carried through difficult trade routes, and purchased for extraordinary sums, seemed worthy of extraordinary powers. Its spiral form provided an additional visual argument, matching artistic traditions that already depicted the unicorn with a long, twisted horn. Natural history initially did little to dissolve the connection. During the 1550s, Swiss scholar Konrad Gessner assembled his influential works on animals, combining observations, older authorities, travelers' reports, illustrations, and inherited traditions. Unicorns appeared within this intellectual landscape alongside creatures whose existence was firmly established. Narwhal tusks could therefore function as apparent physical evidence supporting descriptions that had circulated for generations. The problem was not simply credulity. Early naturalists worked in a world where specimens traveled much farther than reliable information about their origins. A scholar might inspect an authentic tusk while receiving an inaccurate account of the animal that produced it. Physical evidence and mistaken interpretation could occupy the same cabinet. Ole Worm, the Danish physician and natural historian, helped weaken that connection during the 17th century. Through his study of northern specimens and reports, he recognized that supposed unicorn horns could originate from narwhals. By 1638, he had publicly associated the celebrated ivory with a marine animal rather than a terrestrial unicorn, yet correcting the anatomy did not immediately erase centuries of cultural investment. Royal treasuries still contained valuable tusks. Apothecaries still had customers. Artists and writers still possessed an established symbol whose meaning extended beyond zoology. Even as better descriptions of whales circulated, belief could persist because mythology was serving purposes that anatomical classification could not simply remove. During the 1700s, European natural history increasingly placed the tusk where it belonged, inside the biology of the narwhal. Classification, Arctic exploration, collected specimens, and more systematic observation made the older interpretation progressively harder to sustain among scholars. Popular imagination changed more slowly. The strange result was that scientific knowledge and cultural memory separated. Europe eventually learned that the ivory came from a whale, yet unicorns remained embedded in heraldry, literature, religious art, and childhood stories. The correction changed the specimen without destroying the symbol. For generations, an Arctic tooth had crossed boundaries between commerce, medicine, faith, and monarchy. It had been swallowed as powder, guarded as an antidote, studied as evidence, and assembled into a throne. The narwhal never needed to enter a European palace. Its mythology had arrived centuries before the animal was understood. Long before narwhal behavior could be reconstructed from satellite tracks, depth recorders, or aerial cameras, it was already being read from the ice itself. Inuit hunters learned where breathing openings would persist, when pods would enter particular channels, how weather altered their movements, and which changes in water or ice meant that animals were nearby. This knowledge did not come from distant observation. It accumulated through generations of travel, hunting, listening, memory, and survival in the same environment as the whales. Across Greenland and the Canadian High Arctic, names and traditions vary among Inuit languages and communities, reflecting relationships shaped by local waters rather than a single universal account. Narwhals were food, material, livelihood, and part of a living ecological system whose patterns had practical consequences. Hunters needed to recognize seasonal movement, group behavior, diving rhythms, and the use of openings in sea ice with enough accuracy to return home safely. Knowledge also traveled through stories. One well-known Inuit narrative tells of a woman attached to a harpoon line and pulled into the sea. As she is transformed into a narwhal, her braided hair becomes the animal's spiraling tusk. The story exists in different forms, and modern interpretations should not reduce it to a biological lesson. Yet its association between a woman and a tusked narwhal carries an intriguing natural detail. Although tusks are far more common in males, females can develop them too, something Arctic communities could encounter directly. For outside researchers, many comparable observations became scientifically visible only after instruments made them measurable. Inuit hunters had already developed detailed knowledge of where narwhals gathered, how they responded to changing ice, where they traveled at different times of year, and how their behavior shifted with local conditions. Such understanding was preserved through experience and oral transmission rather than journals or laboratory records, but its usefulness depended on repeated testing against the Arctic itself. Modern narwhal research increasingly recognizes that distinction without treating one system as a substitute for the other. Indigenous knowledge can identify patterns, locations, unusual behaviors, and changes spanning lifetimes. Scientific instruments can attach measurements to those observations, compare populations, and examine processes hidden inside the body. When the two approaches meet carefully, each can guide the other toward details that might otherwise remain unnoticed. That collaboration became especially visible in Nunavut during research reported in 2025, when drone observations documented narwhals interacting with fish using their tusks. The work depended on partnership with Inuit communities whose familiarity with the animals helped place researchers where meaningful behavior could actually be observed. A camera in the Arctic is useful only after someone knows where and when to point it. Dentist and researcher Martin Nuia followed a similar path during more than 14 years of work on the narwhal tusk. Rather than treating Inuit testimony as background color, his research incorporated knowledge from elders and hunters while investigating the tusk's anatomy and sensory function. Their observations helped shape the questions examined through microscopy, anatomy, and field research. The result is a different model of studying an animal that remains difficult to observe for most of its life. Data no longer need to begin when an electronic tag touches a whale. They can begin with remembered ice conditions, inherited hunting knowledge, repeated sightings, and patterns carried between generations. For centuries, outsiders possessed narwhal ivory while knowing remarkably little about the animal that grew it. Inuit communities possessed something less portable and more precise, accumulated familiarity with a living species in its own environment. Modern research is increasingly learning to place those records beside instruments, not beneath them. A species can look secure when viewed from far enough away. Across the Arctic, narwhals still number well into the hundreds of thousands, yet those animals are not distributed as one freely mixing population. They belong to summering groups tied to particular fjords, bays, and coastal waters, and conservation becomes more complicated when the map is examined at that smaller scale. The most widely cited global estimate is roughly 172,000 animals, based on surveyed stocks, although some parts of the range remain poorly counted. Most live in the waters of Canada and Greenland, especially around Baffin Bay and the Canadian High Arctic. Canada alone holds roughly 90% of the animals represented in that global estimate, making its northern waters the demographic center of the species. At the global level, the International Union for Conservation of Nature has classified the narwhal as least concern. That category describes extinction risk across the species as a whole. It does not mean every local group is equally abundant, equally well studied, or exposed to the same pressures. A large total can contain much smaller populations whose futures depend on conditions in a particular stretch of Arctic coastline. Canada's most recent national assessment illustrates that distinction. In May 2024, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada assessed the northern Hudson Bay and Baffin Bay narwhal subpopulations as not at risk. Systematic aerial surveys produced a combined Canadian abundance estimate above 161,000 animals, with roughly 93,000 believed to be mature. Available evidence showed no overall declining trend, while the northern Hudson Bay population appeared stable or slowly increasing. The same assessment carried an important restraint. Narwhals reproduce slowly, live for many decades, and depend on environments undergoing rapid physical change. Pollution was ranked among the important threats, while climate change, severe weather, hunting, and increasing human activity remained part of the conservation picture. Ship traffic and ice breaking bring another pressure into waters that historically experienced far less industrial sound. Researchers have documented changes in narwhal movement during exposure to vessel and seismic noise, revealing how disturbance can alter behavior even when population decline is not yet visible. Greenland presents a more uneven picture. Some stocks have generated serious concern because abundance is low, harvest pressure has been debated, and reliable trends are difficult to establish. Management, therefore, cannot rely on the global total alone. A loss from one fjord system is not automatically repaired by thousands of animals living hundreds of miles away. That separation is written into narwhal behavior. Many return with remarkable fidelity to the same summering regions, following inherited migratory traditions between seasonal habitats. Movement between recognized stocks can occur, but it is limited enough that scientists cannot assume neighboring animals will rapidly replace a depleted group. Geography divides the species into biological neighborhoods, each carrying its own history. This makes the narwhal's conservation status less like a single number and more like a mosaic. One region may hold tens of thousands, while another supports only a fraction of that abundance. One survey may suggest stability, while another area remains uncertain because counting whales beneath Arctic water and ice is inherently difficult. For now, the species remains numerous. Its strongest populations show no established broad collapse. Yet abundance offers protection only when the habitats, migration routes, prey, and local groups behind that abundance remain intact. The narwhal survives across an enormous Arctic range, but its future is decided in smaller places, one returning population at a time. Within waters, each generation learns again. For a narwhal, sea ice is not simply shelter floating above the ocean, it is geography. Its seasonal edges help define where a population travels, where it spends winter, where it gathers in summer, and which feeding grounds become accessible along the way. The conservation of Arctic flora and fauna describes narwhals among the marine mammals most closely associated with ice, a dependence built into the timing and structure of their lives. Warming alters that structure without removing it all at once. Ice forms later in autumn, retreats earlier in spring, and varies more strongly between years and regions. Routes that generations encountered under familiar seasonal conditions can therefore change within the lifetime of a single whale. A passage may remain open longer than expected. Another may freeze rapidly after unusual winds move broken ice together. For an animal whose migrations are synchronized with recurring ice conditions, greater variability can matter as much as the long decline in total coverage. Retreating ice also changes who can enter Arctic waters. Longer open water seasons allow ships to travel through places that were once inaccessible for much of the year. Engines, propellers, ice breaking, and industrial activity add sound to an environment where narwhals depend heavily on acoustic information. Their echolocation is exceptionally directional, allowing them to examine prey and surroundings through returning echoes. Human noise can overlap with the broader acoustic world in which those signals are produced and interpreted. Field studies have found that narwhals respond to vessels and seismic activity at considerable distances. Animals may interrupt feeding, change swimming direction, alter diving behavior, or leave areas where disturbance persists. The cost is not merely the sound itself. A disrupted feeding dive means lost opportunity. Avoidance means movement that consumes energy. Repeated disturbance can separate an animal from habitat selected precisely because prey, depth, and ice normally make that location useful. Their unusual defensive physiology adds another layer. When threatened, narwhals can combine vigorous swimming with profound slowing of the heart, a response already suited to brief encounters with predators and other acute danger. Persistent or frequently repeated disturbance creates a different problem. The same ancient response can be triggered in circumstances that do not end after a predator passes. Researchers remain cautious about translating short-term reactions into population effects, but the physiological mismatch is clear enough to deserve concern. Changing freeze patterns can also rearrange the circumstances surrounding ice entrapment. Later, freeze up does not simply mean fewer opportunities for whales to become enclosed. Wind, temperature, currents, and rapidly forming ice can still close openings, sometimes in places or at times that historical experience may not predict. The danger lies partly in instability, because inherited movement traditions were shaped under environmental rhythms that are becoming less dependable. Food adds another moving boundary. Greenland halibut thrive in cold northern waters and form an important part of winter feeding for many narwhals. Ocean temperature, currents, sea ice, and ecosystem changes can influence where such prey concentrate. If profitable feeding areas shift, narwhals may need to alter established movements to remain connected with them. That adjustment is not equivalent to drawing a new route across a map. Narwhals live through learned and inherited patterns of place. Familiar winter grounds contain depths, prey fields, ice conditions, and recurring access to air that generations have successfully navigated. Moving elsewhere means entering an ocean whose seasonal structure may be less familiar. Climate change, therefore, reaches the narwhal through several connected pathways. It reshapes ice, opens water to traffic, changes the acoustic environment, alters the reliability of migration, and can move the prey beneath it. The threat is not simply that the Arctic becomes warmer. It is that the relationships making this specialized life possible begin changing at different speeds, all at once. A narwhal can disappear beneath broken ice in seconds, leaving researchers with little more than a patch of disturbed water and a location on a map. Much of narwhal science begins with that disappearance. The animal spends most of its life beyond direct human observation, often beneath pack ice and far from settlements, so researchers have learned to send instruments where people cannot follow. Among the most important are animal-borne tags, compact devices attached to captured narwhals before release. Depending on the study, these instruments can record depth, movement, acceleration, heart activity, muscle stroke, frequency, and sound. Instead of watching a dive from above, scientists can reconstruct it from the whale's own motion. A descent becomes a sequence of body strokes, changing pressure, slowing heartbeat, and acoustic activity recorded second by second. Obtaining those measurements is the difficult part. Researchers must work with experienced local hunters and field teams, locate narwhals, handle them for as little time as possible, attach equipment securely, collect measurements, and release the animals. Some tags transmit information through satellites when the whale surfaces. Others are designed to detach, rise through the water, and be recovered, turning a small floating instrument into the container for days or weeks of otherwise unreachable behavior. The study published in Science in 2017 emerged from fieldwork in East Greenland, where researchers examined the extraordinary cardiovascular response of narwhals after capture and release. Sensors recorded heart rate alongside swimming effort, revealing the unusual combination of intense muscular activity and profound slowing of the heart. The finding depended on measurements gathered from a living animal moving freely after release, something no laboratory reconstruction could fully reproduce. Other questions required distance rather than contact. Hydrophones, essentially underwater microphones built for scientific recording, can remain beneath ice or near the seafloor for long periods. They collect clicks, calls, and other sounds from animals that may never enter human sight. From these recordings, researchers can identify seasonal presence, examine changes in vocal behavior, and study how narwhals respond when vessels or other sources of noise enter their habitat. Aerial observation has opened another window. Modern drones can hover far enough away to reduce disturbance, while cameras record fine movements near the surface. Research reported in 2025 used this perspective to document interactions involving tusks and prey, behavior that would have been difficult to recognize from a boat. The method does not replace tagging or acoustic monitoring. It adds a view of posture, spacing, pursuit, and contact that instruments carried on a whale may not reveal. Even the tusk has demanded years of fieldwork. Martin Nguyen and collaborators built research across 14 years, working with Inuit communities and obtaining fresh biological material under conditions suitable for examining living tissue and nerve connections. Museum specimens could preserve shape, but many questions about sensation required material collected before delicate structures deteriorated. Narwhal research is therefore assembled from fragments gathered by different methods. A depth record may come from a tag, a winter presence from a hydrophone, a precise movement from drone footage, and anatomical evidence from a subsistence harvest already taking place within an Inuit community. None alone describes the animal completely. Behind each plotted line sits a chain of practical decisions shaped by weather, ice, equipment, animal welfare, local knowledge, and chance. Months of preparation can produce only a brief encounter. Instruments can vanish beneath inaccessible ice without recovery. Conditions can close a field season early. Yet, over decades, those scattered measurements accumulate, allowing an animal hidden beneath Arctic ice to become scientifically visible without ever becoming easy to reach. In 1990, a hunter working in Disco Bay, Greenland, encountered a whale whose skull refused to fit neatly into either familiar Arctic form. It lacked the architecture expected of a narwhal, yet it was equally unlike a beluga. The specimen eventually reached scientific collections, where its unusual teeth preserved the record of an encounter between two lineages separated for millions of years. Later genetic analysis established that the animal was a hybrid, born from a female narwhal and a male beluga. Its existence was possible because the two species, despite diverging roughly 11 to 15 million years ago, remain genetically close relatives. Their bodies, migrations, feeding habits, and social lives have followed different evolutionary paths, but the biological boundary between them is not absolute. The skull made that blurred boundary visible. Instead of the narwhal's single projecting tusk or the beluga's ordinary rows of teeth, the hybrid possessed an extraordinary set of forward projecting teeth in its lower jaw. Several were elongated and twisted, producing a dental arrangement found in neither parent species. Development had combined inherited instructions that normally operate within very different mouths, creating anatomy with no standard counterpart among living whales. Scientists eventually gave this unusual animal an informal name, Narluga, joining narwhal and beluga in a word as blended as the specimen itself, yet its importance extends beyond appearance. Researchers examining chemical signatures preserved in the skull found that the hybrid had eaten differently from either parental species. Stable isotopes, chemical traces accumulated through feeding, suggested prey associated with the seafloor and a dietary niche distinct from typical narwhal and beluga patterns. That result reveals something subtle about hybrid animals. A body assembled from two evolutionary histories does not necessarily behave as a simple midpoint between them. Different jaws can favor different prey. Different swimming behavior can place an animal in another part of the water column. Even within a familiar Arctic ecosystem, the hybrid appears to have found a workable way of feeding that belongs specifically to itself. The relationship between narwhals and belugas also reaches deeper than this single skull. A genetic study published in 2019 confirmed the specimen's mixed ancestry and identified the narwhal as its mother. Broader genomic evidence has also indicated gene flow between these closely related whales during their evolutionary history. Hybridization, then, is not merely an anatomical curiosity. Under rare circumstances, reproductive boundaries between these lineages can become permeable. Rarity still matters. Narwhals and belugas overlap in portions of the Arctic, yet they differ enough in habitat preference, seasonal movement, communication, and social behavior that opportunities for mating appear uncommon. Natural selection has maintained two recognizable species, even though reproduction between them remains biologically possible. Species boundaries in nature can therefore resemble broad zones rather than perfectly sealed walls. The Narluga carries that ambiguity in bone. Its strange teeth are not evidence that either parent species is incomplete, nor that their differences are disappearing. They show instead how ancient developmental instructions can interact when two related genomes meet inside one animal. Traits shaped separately across immense spans of time can be rearranged into a form evolution had rarely tested. For the narwhal, this hybrid leaves an especially unusual record. The developmental machinery associated with its remarkable dentition remained capable of expression inside a mixed genome, but it did not simply reproduce the familiar tusk. It generated another configuration entirely, shaped by genetic instructions inherited from both sides of its ancestry. Preserved in a Greenland skull is a small evolutionary experiment, one animal standing between two established lineages, carrying features inherited from both while belonging perfectly to neither. Once removed from the animal, a narwhal tusk begins a second existence. The living tooth that once carried nerves, blood vessels, and sensory tissue becomes ivory, dense enough to survive centuries of handling. Its spiral remains visible long after every trace of the whale itself has vanished, preserving the growth pattern that made the material recognizable across cultures separated by oceans and generations. European craftsmen valued narwhal ivory for more than its supposed supernatural origin. The material is exceptionally durable, takes a polished surface, and resists some of the discoloration and cracking associated with other ivories. During the medieval and early modern periods, those physical qualities helped transform tusks into objects intended to outlast their owners. Apothecaries and court workshops cut sections into cups and vessels whose material carried a promise no craftsmanship could actually fulfill. A drink poured into one of these cups was believed to become safer because poison would supposedly react with the unicorn horn. Some vessels were thought capable of revealing contamination through bubbling or other visible changes. The ivory performed no such chemistry, yet belief gave the cup enormous value. An object carved from a whale tooth could sit beside royal food and medicine as protection against assassination, its usefulness resting entirely on a mistaken understanding of the animal that produced it. Farther north, the same material belonged to a different tradition. Inuit communities had access to narwhal tusks through subsistence hunting and treated ivory as a useful resource as well as a medium for skilled carving. It could become tools, harpoon components, needles, ornaments, and later works made for trade or artistic expression. In that setting, the tusk was connected directly to the animal, the hunt, and the practical economy of Arctic life. There was no need to invent another creature to explain where it came from. Some European objects have endured almost unchanged. In Copenhagen, the Rosenborg throne still preserves narwhal ivory incorporated into a royal object completed in 1671. Its survival reveals the durability that made tusks desirable in the first place. Generations of rulers, curators, and visitors have passed around it while the material itself has remained, carrying an Arctic animal into a setting of ceremony, monarchy, and display. Modern tusks move through a far more regulated world. International trade in narwhal parts falls under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which requires documentation and permits for international commercial movement where trade is allowed. National and regional laws can impose additional restrictions, including rules affecting imports into the United States and the European Union. A tusk that once crossed borders as an exotic wonder now travels, when legally permitted, through systems of quotas, certificates, conservation assessments, and customs controls. Much of the ivory entering legal circulation today originates from regulated subsistence hunts in Canada and Greenland. Those hunts remain tied to indigenous food security, cultural practice, and local economies, while management decisions surrounding quotas continue to draw scientific and political scrutiny. The object therefore carries several histories at once: biological structure, harvested resource, cultural material, commodity, and conservation concern. Museums preserve, perhaps the strangest final chapter. Old collections, still contain narwhal tusks acquired when Europeans cataloged them as unicorn horn. Modern labels correct the identification, but they cannot erase the earlier centuries attached to the object. Inside a display case, the spiral remains exactly what it always was. Only the human explanation around it has changed. What once served as medicine, protection, royal treasure, and evidence for a legendary beast now rests under glass as the tooth of a whale, its material unchanged while the story surrounding it has been rewritten. For decades, the narwhal's tusk could be measured, examined, scanned, and analyzed after the animal was gone. Yet its movements in living water remained remarkably difficult to witness. Then cameras rose above Creswell Bay on Somerset Island in Nunavut, and an old anatomical mystery became a sequence of visible actions. The recordings were made during the summer of 2022, then analyzed in research published in Frontiers in Marine Science in 2025. Researchers from the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute at Florida Atlantic University worked with Fisheries and Oceans Canada and other partners. With field research supported through collaboration in the Canadian High Arctic, instead of approaching narwhals closely from boats, the team used remotely operated aerial cameras. Calm water, continuous summer daylight, and visibility beneath the surface allowed successive flights to follow animals for extended periods without placing observers among them. For stretches approaching 2 hours, repeated flights preserved movements that previously might have lasted only seconds in the memory of an observer watching from water level. What appeared below the aircraft was far more intricate than a simple strike. Narwhals encountered Arctic char near shore and began tracking individual fish with extraordinary control. The whales rolled their bodies, altered direction, and adjusted the angle of their tusks as the char accelerated and turned. Some pursuits included extremely tight changes in direction, with whales rotating onto their sides so the tusk tip could remain aligned with a moving fish. Contact varied with circumstance. At times, the tip touched or redirected a char without obvious force. In other sequences, rapid lateral movements delivered repeated blows powerful enough to incapacitate, stun, or possibly kill the fish. A narwhal could then continue tracking the prey as it attempted to escape. The tusk was therefore functioning not merely as something carried through the water, but as a precisely controlled structure whose position changed continuously in relation to another moving animal. Across the observations, researchers identified 17 distinct behaviors involving narwhals, fish, and their surrounding ecological setting. Tusk use included investigation, manipulation, pursuit, and forceful contact. Some interactions between narwhals appeared competitive, with one animal interfering with another's access to a fish. Others seemed more compatible with communication or affiliation. The footage also suggested exploratory behavior and possible play, including interactions in which immediate feeding did not appear to be the purpose. Another participant entered these scenes from above. Glaucous gulls gathered, while narwhals pursued char near the surface and attempted to seize fish during the chase. Their presence created a three-species contest in which a whale's hunting attempt could become an opportunity for a bird. The researchers described this as attempted food stealing, adding another ecological relationship to behavior that had previously been almost impossible to observe directly. The recordings also raised the possibility of social learning. Narwhals altered their behavior in the presence of companions, and some patterns suggested that individuals could gain information by observing one another. The evidence did not establish a formal teaching system, but it revealed enough behavioral flexibility to make shared learning a serious scientific possibility. Yet the camera's greatest strength also marked its boundary. It could reveal the surface world with unprecedented detail, but it could not follow narwhals into their deepest winter feeding grounds. Greenland halibut are pursued thousands of feet below, beneath conditions no aerial camera can penetrate. The drone solved part of the tusk story by watching living whales use it with precision. Beyond that illuminated patch of Arctic water, much of the narwhal's hunting life remains recorded only by instruments, sound, and traces carried back from depth. For an animal recognized instantly by a single tooth, the narwhal remains surrounded by an unusual amount of unfinished science. Its tusk has yielded nerves, blood vessels, chemical records, evidence of contact with prey, and traces of social behavior. Yet those findings have not converged on one explanation for why evolution enlarged this tooth so dramatically, especially in males. Sensory function, sexual selection, competition, display, hunting, and social communication may all contribute. Their relative importance remains unsettled. Far below the surface lies another gap that cameras have never crossed. Greenland halibut form an important part of the winter diet, and tracking instruments show narwhals descending to depths approaching 4,900 feet. Researchers can reconstruct the path downward, measure time spent near the bottom, and examine stomach contents afterward. They can listen to changes in echolocation as whales search at depth. No observer, however, has watched the final approach to a halibut on the seafloor. Whether the prey is chased, suction-fed, struck, cornered against sediment, or captured through some combination of behaviors remains beyond direct observation. The narwhal's heart presents a different kind of uncertainty. During escape responses, heart rate can fall dramatically, even while swimming effort increases. Ordinarily, intense muscular work demands greater circulation, yet this animal can combine vigorous movement with profound bradycardia. Measurements establish that the paradox occurs. They do not fully explain how cardiac tissue and other organs tolerate the competing demands without injury, particularly during repeated disturbance. Social encounters carry mysteries of their own. Males sometimes cross or rub tusks, but the meaning of these contacts has not been decoded. Researchers cannot yet determine how partners are chosen, whether an encounter communicates status, identity, reproductive condition, familiarity, or several signals at once. Even the sensory capacity of the tusk complicates interpretation. Experiments indicate that environmental changes, such as salinity, can produce physiological responses through exposed sensory pathways, while its strong sexual dimorphism points towards sexual selection. Evolution may have shaped one structure for several purposes, rather than a single defining task. Some unknowns exist because the right instrument has never been present at the right moment. During a savset, when shifting ice confines narwhals to limited openings, researchers still lack a complete acoustic record from beneath the ice. The pattern of calling during prolonged entrapment and how communication changes as breathing space contracts remains poorly documented. Such recordings could reveal coordination among trapped animals, but obtaining them during an unpredictable and hazardous event is exceptionally difficult. Navigation is equally elusive. Narwhals repeatedly return to particular summering regions after seasonal journeys spanning hundreds of miles. Their routes can be mapped with satellite tags, yet a map records where an animal traveled, not how it knew where to go. Possible cues include underwater topography, currents, chemical gradients, celestial information when available, Earth's magnetic field, learned routes, and knowledge transmitted through social groups. No single mechanism has been demonstrated as the governing compass. These gaps persist partly because narwhals occupy a world that limits observation itself. Instruments detach, batteries expire, ice blocks retrieval, weather shortens field seasons, and the deepest behavior occurs far beyond human vision. Even successful studies often capture fragments rather than complete lives. Each missing observation leaves several plausible explanations sharing the same evidence. That incompleteness gives the scientific record its proper shape. Knowledge of the narwhal is not an empty page, nor is it a finished portrait. It is a detailed image with boundaries still unresolved, assembled from anatomy, genetics, acoustics, indigenous knowledge, tags, aerial observation, and patient inference. The remaining spaces mark the places where evidence ends, and where the animal continues living beyond direct human sight. A tooth can outlive every explanation attached to it, removed from the animal that grew it, carried across oceans, placed in palaces, workshops, laboratories, and collections. The narwhal tusk has repeatedly entered human history as something more than anatomy. Its material has remained the same, while its meaning has changed around it, shaped by distance, knowledge, belief, and the needs of whoever happened to hold it. For Arctic communities living beside narwhals, the tusk belonged first to an animal whose movements were known through experience. Stories of transformation gave that relationship another language, joining human life, hunting, ancestry, and the sea. Farther south, where the living whale was almost impossible to encounter, the same object arrived without its body. Medieval Europeans could see the spiral, touch its polished surface, and possess it, but they lacked the animal itself as context. Into that absence came the unicorn, purity, protection, medicine, and royal authority. Centuries later, natural history changed the label without exhausting the mystery. The horn became a tooth, yet identifying its origin only opened another set of problems. Anatomists found living tissue and sensory pathways. Chemists discovered environmental records preserved through growth. Behavioral observations added contact with prey, objects, and other narwhals. What had once been interpreted through magic was now interpreted through physiology and evolution, but the impulse remained familiar. A visible structure this unusual seemed to demand a purpose large enough to match its appearance. That demand can be misleading. Evolution does not design symbols, nor does it owe every structure one tidy function. A trait may begin under one pressure, acquire another role, and later become useful in several contexts at once. The tusk can therefore be sensory tissue, a sexually selected feature, a social instrument, and an occasional hunting tool, without any one description erasing the others. Human explanations tend to seek a single answer. Biology often preserves layers. Even its spiral encourages meanings that have little to do with teeth. Spirals recur in shells, storms, climbing plants, and vast astronomical structures. Although they arise from entirely different physical processes, human cultures have repeatedly associated the form with growth, cycles, continuity, movement, or infinity. On a narwhal, however, the spiral is produced by the patterned growth of dentine as the tooth extends outward. Its symbolism belongs to us. Its structure belongs to the animal. Perhaps that distinction explains much of the tusk's long cultural life. Most of a narwhal remains difficult for humans to witness. Its migrations cross remote waters, its feeding carries it beneath ice, and many of its behaviors unfold beyond direct observation. the tusk crosses that boundary. It enters daylight, photographs, stories, trade, scientific collections, and memory. It is the portion of an elusive life that can be held in two hands. Yet possession has never guaranteed understanding. A king could own a tusk without knowing its origin. An apothecary could grind one without knowing its biology. A museum could catalog one under a mythical name. Modern researchers can map nerves, chemistry, genetics, and behavior while still debating why natural selection shaped the tooth into this particular form. Across those changing interpretations, the tusk becomes almost a record of human knowledge itself. Each age looked at the same spiral and found an answer consistent with the world it understood. Transformation, purity, status, medicine, anatomy, sensation, competition, feeding, communication, and environmental history have all occupied the same narrow piece of ivory. None altered what the narwhal had grown. The animal carried no mythology beneath the ice and needed no theory for its tooth, meaning accumulated only after human attention reached it. The spiral endured while explanations changed, leaving behind an unusual meeting place between biology and imagination, where a real structure could remain factual, useful, measurable, and still larger than any single story told about it. Extinction does not always arrive as the disappearance of an entire species. Sometimes it begins with an empty migration route, a feeding ground no longer visited, or a coastline where a familiar animal stops returning. For narwhals, this smaller geography matters because the species is not one interchangeable population spread evenly across the Arctic. It is a mosaic of communities, each bound with unusual fidelity to particular waters. Within those waters, narwhals occupy a place that remains only partly measured. They descend into deep Arctic ecosystems and consume Greenland halibut and other prey beyond the regular reach of many marine predators. Food gathered near the seafloor is carried upward through movement, digestion, waste, and eventually decomposition, linking biological material across different depths. Scientists understand that marine mammals participate in nutrient cycling, but the narwhal's precise contribution has never been fully quantified. Losing a local population would therefore remove an ecological process before its scale had even been calculated. Something else would vanish from the scientific record. A tusk grows over years while incorporating chemical traces related to diet, environmental conditions, and exposure to contaminants. Old specimens already allow researchers to look backward into Arctic environments that existed before satellites provided continuous observation from above. Living narwhals keep extending that archive into the present. If they disappear from a region, the biological record ends there as well. Museum specimens would remain, but the sequence would no longer receive new pages. For Inuit communities, the absence would have dimensions that cannot be reduced to ecology. Narwhals have long been connected with food, materials, travel knowledge, hunting practice, language, observation, and stories carried between generations. These relationships differ among communities and should not be compressed into a single cultural meaning. What they share is duration. Human knowledge and narwhal behavior have developed beside one another across generations, making local disappearance a change in both an ecosystem and a living body of experience. That possibility is especially important in Greenland, where some small subpopulations have been assessed under severe pressure. Scientific projections for 3 groups have estimated extinction probabilities greater than 62% under particular combinations of hunting levels and population assumptions, with warnings focused on the immediate years around 2028. Such projections are models rather than prophecies, but their short time horizon changes the scale of the concern. A species can remain globally present, while particular communities vanish from waters they occupied for generations. Replacement is not simple. Narwhals repeatedly return to established seasonal grounds, and neighboring groups do not behave like spare populations waiting to occupy an abandoned range. Routes through ice, dependable feeding areas, recurring passages, and places suitable for breathing are encountered through individual experience and may also be reinforced socially. When a local group disappears, some of that accumulated behavioral knowledge disappears with it. Genes can describe inherited biology, but they cannot preserve every learned path through a changing sea. The deeper history makes this vulnerability unusually difficult to read. Genetic evidence indicates that narwhals passed through a major population bottleneck in the past and nevertheless persisted. Survival once, however, does not establish a guarantee for another rapid contraction. Earlier changes unfolded under ecological conditions unlike those now developing, when warming, altered ice, shipping, hunting pressure, prey shifts, and disturbance can overlap within the same habitat. A world containing narwhals could therefore become poorer long before the final narwhal disappeared. Loss can occur population by population, route by route, and tradition by tradition, leaving the species name intact while pieces of its ecological and cultural existence fall away. What remains would still be called Monodon monoceros, but part of what that name once contained would already be gone. Beneath moving ice, water circulates through channels humans rarely enter, carrying sound, salt, prey, and memory through a landscape that continually rearranges itself. The narwhal belongs to that hidden geography so completely that much of its ordinary life remains beyond observation. Across that immense span, climates cooled and warmed, glaciers advanced and withdrew, coastlines shifted, and marine communities changed around its ancestors. The lineage endured by becoming increasingly fitted to cold water, deep diving, seasonal ice, and limited access to air. Yet, adaptation is always written for conditions that already existed. It cannot anticipate the speed or direction of every future change. A physiology refined over millions of years can meet a new environment changing within generations. It carries no idea of unicorns, royal collections, old medicines, scientific debates, conservation categories, or the human fascination surrounding its tooth. The animal follows sensory information, learned routes, prey, companions, openings in ice, and signals carried through water. Its heart slows during descent. Echolocation returns the shape of what vision cannot provide. Then lungs that have been waiting under pressure eventually require the surface again. Even the tusk, after centuries of interpretation, refuses to settle into a single human definition. It contains sensory tissue capable of responding to the surrounding environment. Its growth preserves chemical traces of years already lived. Males use it socially, and observations have shown it contacting prey and objects with remarkable control. Sexual selection has also left its signature in the enormous difference between the typical tusks of males and females. These functions can coexist, layered into one structure whose evolutionary history remains only partly reconstructed. Human knowledge has expanded through tags, underwater microphones, genetics, aerial cameras, anatomy, and generations of Inuit experience. A camera sees only while light, weather, distance, and batteries permit. Data can follow a whale downward without placing human eyes beside it. That distance once gave the narwhal refuge from explanation and exploitation alike. Now remoteness offers less protection. Warmer water can enter habitats without waiting for researchers. Ships can cross passages that ice once closed. Prey can shift distribution. Familiar seasonal patterns can loosen. The animal continues reading the conditions immediately around its body, while the larger system producing those conditions changes on a scale no tusk can control. We are beginning to see the narwhal more clearly at the same moment that the Arctic it knows is becoming less dependable. Knowledge does not automatically prevent loss, but ignorance no longer provides innocence once change has been measured. To discover how precisely an animal belongs to a place is also to discover what can happen when that place is altered faster than inherited behavior can follow. The ocean will keep much of the narwhal beyond us. Some dives will never be recorded. Some social signals may remain undeciphered. Routes learned across generations may contain information no instrument can fully translate. Mystery, however, does not make the animal unknowable. It marks the boundary between what evidence has revealed and what living systems still keep to themselves. And somewhere beneath Arctic ice, a narwhal continues without needing our conclusion. It descends through cold water, listens to returning echoes, carries its spiral tooth ahead of it, and finds its way through a world written in pressure, sound, salt, and ice. The question has never belonged to the tusk alone. It belongs to the changing ocean around it, and to whether there will remain enough of that ocean for the narwhal to keep answering in its own way.